Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's video on 5 reboots that I'd like to see. In this video, I count down the top 5 properties I would actually like to see rebooted. For the purposes of this list, I look at both TV shows and films, and list the ones I think need a fresh start. So before I get into this, I think I should clarify the difference between sequels, prequels, spin-offs, and reboots. Sequels and prequels generally continue the same storyline, have the same characters, are set in the same universe. Sequels simply take place after the original piece, whereas prequels take place before it. Thus, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is a prequel because it takes place before the events of Raiders in the Lost Ark, whereas The Last Crusade, despite the opening sequence that shows Indiana Jones as a kid, takes place mostly after the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark and thus is considered a sequel. Spin-offs is more of a term used for TV shows. That is a show set in the same universe and world as another show but focuses on different characters or settings, such as Frasier, being a spin-off from Cheers, as its main character was from that show and thus set in the same universe. And Star Trek Deep Space Nine, being a spin-off of Star Trek Next Generation, has it set in the same Star Trek universe but focuses on different characters in a different setting. And this term typically is only applied to shows, but one could use it to describe some movies, such as Star Wars Rogue One, could be said to be a spin-off of Star Wars, as it focuses on different characters in the same universe. But then again, there's a more modern term for that applies for things like the Marvel movies, where multiple movies take place in the same universe where characters cross over, and that's a shared cinematic universe. But that's getting into a whole nother can of worms. And with shows, some can be combinations, such as Better Call Saul could be seen as a spin-off prequel of Breaking Bad because it has different setting in the same universe but takes place before the events of Breaking Bad. Same with Star Trek Enterprise. But something like 24 Legacy or Star Trek Next Generation could be seen as a spin-off sequel because it comes after the events but it focuses on different characters. Whereas something like 24 Live Another Day and the new Prison Break series are simply direct sequels. Although sometimes they're just considered later seasons of the same show, such as the X-Files' latest miniseries, which was later deemed season 10, and so on and so forth, and you get my point. So the reason I bring up all these things and make these distinctions is to clarify that these are not what I'm going to be talking about in this video. I'm not talking about sequels or prequels or spin-offs. I'm talking only about reboots. Star Wars The Force Awakens, for example, is a sequel, whereas Star Trek 2009 is a reboot. So the difference with reboots are they erase the events of the original property and start anew. For example, the Batman franchise can be said to be rebooted several times, as Tim Burton's 1989 Batman bears no resemblance to the Batman of the 60s, and Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins is another reboot that bears no resemblance to the two previous versions, and Batman was rebooted once again for Batman v Superman for the DC Cinematic Universe, as this is a totally different version of Batman than we've seen before. However, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin were not reboots, they were sequels. Despite having different actors play them and both films being directed by a different director, they are set in the same universe as the previous Tim Burton films. But just to confuse things a bit more, there are different kinds of reboots, such as the so-called soft reboots. Now, I'm not calling The Force Awakens a soft reboot, as some people have, because the plot is basically, the same as A New Hope, but it is still technically a sequel. It's not a reboot. What I refer more to in the film that is a soft reboot is essentially they start from scratch, but it keeps some connection to the established franchise. A prime example is the aforementioned Star Trek 2009 that finds an in-story reason to restart things, as it has characters from the established timeline go back in time and create an alternate timeline that these newer films now follow. So they are reboots in the sense that they have no obligation to follow the established historical parameters and guidelines and are free to take the story wherever they want to, but it does keep some connection to the established franchise rather than simply starting anew and pretending that everything that came before them never existed, as most reboots do, such as the 2016 Ghostbusters. Another example of a soft reboot are the new XMen films. And now, when X-Men first came out, I remember getting into several arguments with people on whether or not this was a reboot or a prequel. I argued it was a prequel because it pretty much stayed in line with the established universe, even going as far as to feature Wolverine played by Hugh Jackman. However, that film's sequel, Days of Future Past, was clearly a soft reboot, as similar to Star Trek 2009, they found an in-story reason to reset the timeline and start things anew, so they were now free to take the characters wherever they wanted to, as they erased the events of the later movies, but still they bear some connection to that universe. Also, I will point out that the term reboot is typically used when talking about a franchise or group of films. When a singular film is rebooted, it's usually referred to as a remake, such as Total Recall, The Magnificent Seven, Scarface, The Fly, Cape Fear, or Ben-Hur. But it's basically the same thing. And of course, some TV shows have been rebooted as well, such as Battlestar Galactica, Hawaii Five-0, and V. And there have been some reboot remakes that cross the medium of film and television, such as Mission Impossible, Beverly Hillbillies, and The Addams Family are examples of TV shows rebooted as films, or shows like Daredevil being an example of a film rebooted as a show. Something like Stargate SG-1 isn't a reboot, it's a sequel, as it keeps in line with the events that happened in the film, whereas Roland Emmerich is said to be making new Stargate films that will be reboots, as they will erase the events that happened in both the original film and the show. Something like Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles could be said to be both a sequel and a reboot, as it is a sequel to Terminator and Terminator 2, but a reboot to Terminator 3 and Salvation, as it takes place directly after Terminator 2 and pretends the events of Terminator 3 never happened, which I wish they didn't. But something like Terminator Genesis, I guess technically is a soft reboot, as they find an in-story reason to start things over again. But what it really is a fucking mess, as it is, the whole Terminator franchise is a mess now thanks to that piece of shite. So, like most people, I typically hate reboots and remakes, as especially there's been a current craze in Hollywood to reboot, remake, and have a sequel to every beloved film and television franchise they can get their dirty hands on. So this is actually nothing new, as Hollywood has been going crazy with this ever since like the 90s, perhaps even before that, but it could be said to be hit into overdrive in recent times, as Hollywood is all about making money, and franchises with an already established fan base are more likely to draw in the crowds more than an original property no one has heard of. And thus we get a barrage of stupid remakes like Ben-Hur, Total Recall, RoboCop, and Ghostbusters that nobody asked for or wants. In fact, the main response to many of these reboots are, why? Why would you do that? And if the only true answer is the almighty dollar, then I'm sorry, but that's not a good enough reason. For example, I hear that they are planning to make a reboot of Memento. Why the fuck would you remake Memento? It was already perfect. However, sometimes there can be a good reason for a reboot or a remake. Maybe the original wasn't that great in the first place and can be improved upon, like Ocean's 11, or maybe the franchise went astray and needs a fresh start, like X-Men Days of Future Past, or maybe the story is mostly outdated and needs to be told for a new generation with a fresh perspective, like Battlestar Galactica. So although I'm sick of Hollywood rebooting every property it can get its hands on, there are a few reboots I actually want to see. So without any further ado, let me get to my top 5 reboots I actually want to see. So we'll start with my number 5, Quantum Leap. Now, Quantum Leap is a show I used to love when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, and I recently saw a lot of love for this show and heard some opinions expressed that they specifically don't want this show to be rebooted. But there are several reasons why I would absolutely love if they did. Now, let me be clear, I'm not talking about a sequel, I'm talking about a reboot that is erasing the events, the first line TV show, and starting from scratch. First off, the one thing that never sat right with me for this show is that it was an obvious excuse to romanticize about the 50s and 60s and wallow in 60s nostalgia, something I never got behind because I was never alive in the 60s. Moreover, 60s nostalgia was played to death when I was a kid and a teenager, and still to this day seems quite popular, so I've grown incredibly sick of it. It actually hinders me from enjoying this show. And the other main reason is that this show is now very dated and it has too strong of a cheesy 80s feel to it and is far too episodic in nature. Whereas I feel the show would benefit from a more serialized storyline common in modern day television. However, I really like the premise in the characters of the show, so I would absolutely love it to death to see a modern, updated version of this show. To have a character from the 2020s who jumps back mostly in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Being a 90s teenager myself, the one type of nostalgia I love to see and feel we don't get nearly enough of in films is 90s nostalgia. So I would love it if they made it its primary decade. They could really highlight the differences with modern times, as there was no internet or cell phones weren't very commonly used. Plus, one of the highlights of Quantum Leap was the way it explored historical events like the civil rights movement in the 60s and the Vietnam War from a personal perspective, and it could do the same with historical events of the 90s and 2000s, as there were a lot of key events that could be explored, such as the LA riots in the early 90s, or 9/11, or the Iraq War. Plus, as I said, I think a newer version of Quantum Leap could be, use modern television to tell more dynamic, edgy, and relevant stories with a long-term serialized story arc rather than episodic drivel of the 80s. Plus, it would give the show the chance to end it right, as the original Quantum Leap totally botched its ending. So Quantum Leap is a show I would love to see rebooted. Coming in at number 4 is the X-Men. Now, I mentioned this franchise in my introduction as it already had a reboot, but as I said, that was a soft reboot. I strongly feel this franchise needs a hard reboot. Now, before anyone bothers pointing out in the comment section below, I do realize that this is not likely to happen, as Fox is currently making plans to expand rather than reboot this franchise. A 4th X-Men reboot film is planned, as are several X-Men spin-off films and TV series. And Deadpool, which is Fox's hottest property at the moment, is set in this universe. However, I would argue the fourth wall-breaking nature of Deadpool transcends franchises, and so it would be able to transition to any franchise that it likes. But I still would personally love it if Fox puts a halt to their plans and decides to start completely from scratch. This would make a lot of sense to me, seeing how Hugh Jackman has stated several times that he no longer intends to play the character of Wolverine after his latest outing, Logan, which comes out next month. That film is said to be completely independent from the rest of the franchise in terms of continuity. So this seems like the perfect time to punch that reset button. The X-Men was my favorite comic book growing up, and I would love to see it get a proper treatment. What I envision in this film is a film that more closely follows the comic books, that begins the original story of the original X-Men with Charles Xavier tutoring 5 teenage X-Men: Cyclops, Jean Grey, Iceman, Angel, and the Beast. And just that. And in the sequel, they can have it take place years later with these characters in their 20s, and they meet the new X-Men introduced in the 80s like Wolverine, Storm, Rogue, and Havoc. And the next sequel can follow storylines like Fall of the Mutants, where the X-Men faked their deaths, or where Professor X died for a while and Magneto turned good and he took over running the school, or where like a lot of the X-Men died and the whole group got split up and they each went off on their own adventures. So this could allow for some spin-off singular movies, like seeing Wolverine in Australia, which is a storyline they did in the 90s. That was kind of quite cool, and they could even, on these separate adventures, they could meet new characters like Jubilee, Gambit, and whatnot. You know, and they could even splinter off into different other film franchises, like the X Factor, where they take the 5 original X-Men, where Storm and Wolverine can helm like the real X-Men movies, and then the New Mutants, which is the next generation of teenagers that came after the X-Men when they're in their 30s and 40s. This would be a proper way to do it. Has one thing that always bothered me about the X-Men movies is that they're all the characters' ages were off. As Iceman was a teenager while Beast was in his 50s, Rogue was also a really young teenager, and Wolverine was much older, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. If they did something that more resembled the comics, I would love it to death. Plus, no one's ever going to compete with Hugh Jackman, so they need to completely rethink and redo Wolverine and make him more like his comic book counterpart, who was short and stocky and says bub a lot. And for the love of God, Fox, learn from Sony's example and make a deal with Marvel Studios so we can get the Hulk and Wolverine fighting in a movie and Wolverine and Spider-Man crossover. Just swallow your pride and fucking do it! But as I said, to begin with, I know this will never happen, but a boy can dream, can't he? Number 3 on my list is Lost. Now, this may seem like an odd choice for me, as I still hold Lost as one of my all-time favorite TV shows, despite all the hate it gets or its subpar ending. But hear me out. Now, the main reason I would want to reboot it is to fix the ending, as it was not handled very well. Even the 3rd, 4th, and the first part of the 5th season, which were actually really great and featured some of the best moments in all of television, I still think could have been handled a bit better if put into the right hands. Because the one thing about Lost is that it was a show that helped pioneer the whole modern day serialized format that is now commonplace. However, it still was a slave to some conventions from the past, such as long seasons, and thus ended up containing a lot of filler and would lose a lot of people because it seemingly took forever to get anywhere with its story. Plus, there were a lot of issues with the show that came out of that were, not the showrunner's fault. It was out of their hands. It had more to do with politics of being in a network show. And these could be addressed by being on a subscription service like HBO or Netflix, or but just having shorter seasons. And thus, what I imagine is a first 2 seasons that are very similar to the first 2 seasons of the original show, like keeping a lot of the same characters and storylines, but just shortening it and having it more condensed in like only 10 or 13 episodes, which I think would actually improve the show a lot, as it would cut out a lot of the fat and filler, and the show wouldn't seem like it's taking forever to get to the point. I mean, this would pretty much mean every character would only get 1 flashback episode per season, and so they'd be forced to convince their backstories and show only what was totally relevant, because a lot of problems Lost had in its second season that got worse in its 3rd season was the flashbacks were becoming more and more irrelevant and seeming like obligations rather than actually adding anything to the show, to the point where they are avoiding flashbacks in later seasons, which might have worked a bit for seasons 4 and 5, but I feel was a huge mistake to avoid flashbacks in season 6. So seasons 1 and 2 could play out pretty much the same, except shorter, and you could get rid of useless characters like Shannon and Boone and focus more on the main ones. And season 3 could be similar, a bit to it, but start to splinter off in a new direction, whereas seasons 4 and 5 start to be totally different from the original show's counterpart, and season 6 would bear absolutely no resemblance whatsoever. And thus, we might actually get an ending that works. And here's how. Because it's shorter seasons, they could do something like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones, plan out their story from the beginning and stick to the plan so it works better. Hammer your important character, the actors, with contracts when hiring them to ensure they will stay for the whole duration of the show. I mean, just imagine if Mr. Echo never died and he's still around in season 6. Also, keep the same themes that made the show great in season 1 and season 2, such as the bizarre mythology and people having run into each other in the past and having all these 6 degree of separation background. In fact, I'm not even saying that they need to change the resolution to what the island is. They could keep Jacob and the Man in Black and the Smoke Monster and the Mysterious Light. Just plan for it better. Do a better job at incorporating these things from the get-go, and most importantly, don't set up storylines you never resolve. Follow through on every storyline that you set up, which again I think would be much easier to do with shorter seasons formats. And just to be clear, as much as I like Damon Lindelof, I'm a huge fan of The Leftovers, but he needs to be nowhere near this show. Not even Carlton Cuse or J.J. Abrams. They need an entirely new creative team. Oh, holy shit, just imagine Vince Gilligan's Lost. Oh my god, I'm having nergasms just thinking about it. But even if you couldn't get Vince, find someone who's better at actually resolving storylines than Lindelof was. But you would have to make sure they're up to this creative task. But I'm sure there would be someone out there, and I would just love to see Lost rebooted. Coming in at number 2 is Ender's Game. This was my favorite novel as a teenager, and I had been waiting for a long time for them to make a movie out of it, and the occasional rumor would pop up here and there ever since the mid-90s, but it took until 2013 for a film to finally come out, and it was not at all satisfying. The thing about Ender's Game, the film, is that it had all the components to be a great film: a great cast, good special effects, a competent director, good set design, cinematography, and all that. And even the script was well written with good dialogue, well developed characters. The problem with the film, however, was that they tried to blow through far too much story within a 2.5 hour period, and it was painfully obvious to even those who haven't read the books that this was not enough time, and much more time was needed in order to tell this story properly. So I would say it's the film's only flaw, but that flaw is huge. Big enough, in fact, to ruin the entire film. The point is, I know that they could do justice for this story. They just need an extended format to do so, like, for example, a TV show. It's obvious from the film that this should have been an HBO or Netflix style TV show with 8 episodes per season. I reckon they could devote the first 2 seasons to the book Ender's Game, since that's the most important book, which I'm sure there's more than enough material to cover 16 episodes, and then the following seasons can cover the sequel books like Speaker for the Dead, Xenocide, and Children of the Mind. And if the show is really successful, they could even do a spin-off series with the Ender's Shadows novels and its sequels. And I believe that there's enough material there to make a fantastic TV series, and judging by how great the film was, I think they could do a great job if only they devote more time to it, because unfortunately the Ender's Game movie was doomed from the start because there's too much material there to fit into one movie. It needs to be a TV show. So finally, let me get to my number 1 reboot that I would like to see, and that is Aliens versus Predator. People who only heard of this concept from the terrible 2004 movie and its even worse sequel may think that this piece of crap should just be buried and forgotten and never spoken of again. But those who think that probably never read the original Dark Horse graphic novels, which I read when translated into written novel form, because if they had, they would know that the concept could actually be fucking awesome. I was always a huge fan of the first two Predator films, even the second one, which is severely underrated, and also the first two Alien films. After that, both franchises kind of went downhill, and some may be feeling some franchise fatigue from both of these franchises, but I feel a reboot that does this great concept justice could be one of the best horror action films ever, because the graphic novels were fucking wonderful. I went into the 2004 Aliens vs. Predator expecting something even remotely close to the same caliber, which this was not. It did take some concepts like a human woman learning to work with the predators, and it totally ruined it and frankly made a mockery of it. In fact, when I was first watching this film, the first clue that this movie would totally suck is that it was set in modern times on Earth, which was a humongous mistake. The novels were set in the future during Aliens' time on a human colony on another planet, and it was so much more interesting. I remember when I first was complaining about this film and someone asked, well, why do you think the movie was obligated to follow the novels? And the answer is, well, no, I don't think that. It doesn't necessarily have to, but the thing is, an example already exists that an Alien vs. Predator story could be awesome, and this film totally fucking botched it. The first problem is having bad directors such as Paul W.S. Anderson, responsible for the horrible Resident Evil films, and the even worse, the brothers Strauss, who went on to direct Skyline, one of the worst pieces of shit I've ever had the displeasure of sitting through. And instead, we get some good creative minds involved, someone like Robert Rodriguez, who produced the Predators film, or some fresh new indie directors who've proven that they're able to handle a film like this and do it justice and actually want to make a good film and aren't just some hired gun that's more suited for a crappy B-movie. And although it's not mandatory, I say why not follow the graphic novels? Unless you can come up with something better, it's great, so why not fall back to that? I love the Aliens vs. Predator novels, and I love both franchises, and I could see them do it in a way that's awesome if they simply reboot the garbage and start again. So that makes this my number one reboot that I would like to see. So that's it for 5 reboots that I want to see. Be sure to check out my channel for more videos on films and TV shows, as well as many other videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Black Sails, The Expanse, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.